Hello and welcome. I'm Diane Baden, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. We are pleased to present this webinar in our series on RDA, Resource Description and Access. Our presenter is Kelley McGrath, Metadata Management Librarian at the University of Oregon. She is an experienced media cataloger and has worked with videos, ebooks, CD-ROMs, computer games, pictures and posters, kits, games, and a variety of three-dimensional objects. She has been active in online audiovisual catalogers, OLAC, for many years, including several years as chair of OLAC's Cataloging Policy Committee. Kelley coordinated the joint OLAC Music Library Association group that participated in the U.S. National Library's RDA test and is currently OLAC's liaison to CCDA. At any time during the webinar, if you have questions for Kelley, please type them into the question box on your screen. Kelley will leave time at the end to respond to as many questions as possible. The ALCTS Committee invites you to use the Twitter back channel, #ALCTSCE, to interact with other participants during or after this webinar. However, please submit your questions for the presenter in the question box on the screen. We will not monitor Twitter during the presentation. Please note that we are recording the presentation, and you will receive an email shortly after the conclusion of the webinar with a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. And now I will turn the program over to Kelley. There will be a slight pause as we change presenters.
Hello everybody, and welcome to this tour of the highlights of cataloging three-dimensional objects and kits with RDA. As I said at the beginning of my previous webinar on RDA and moving images, there are a lot of open questions about cataloging non-textual materials in RDA, and we are all waiting on best practices. This is my best interpretation of RDA at this point in time. Oops. And let me just check something. So you should be watching for new developments. The webinar will focus on three-dimensional objects and kits in the context of an educational collection in an academic library, which is what I know. This approach would likely also work for public or school libraries, but I may not cover enough detail for a more specialized library such as an art library. I'm going to talk about three-dimensional objects first. These are the materials that were covered by Chapter 10 in AACR 2. How do we define this territory? On the one hand, for the most part, we know it when we see it. However, it's a little more difficult to pin it down with definitions. The things I'm going to talk about are all unmediated, as defined by RDA. This is pretty straightforward and rules out any carrier of digital content or any carrier of analog content in a form that needs some sort of device to decode the content so that it's usable. There are always unusual cases, though, such as this CD sculpture that presents a digital carrier in a way that is meant to be perceived directly without mediation. RDA defines unmediated content as designed to be perceived directly through one or more of the human senses without the aid of an intermediating device. The carrier type for these materials is object. RDA defines this as a three-dimensional artifact or a replica of an artifact or a naturally occurring object. The first definition for artifact in the Oxford English Dictionary is an object made or modified by human workmanship as opposed to one formed by natural processes. Between artifact and naturally occurring object, this covers pretty much anything you can think of, except maybe objects created by non-human animals. Probably the most practical way to think of this in the context of RDA is that any carrier that's not covered by some other special category in RDA should go here. That is to say, anything that is unmediated that doesn't fit into one of the other unmediated categories of carrier type, card, flip chart, roll, sheet, or volume, should be considered an object. Content type is harder, and I'm not going to be able to give you absolute guidance here. There are 4 content types that are associated with the term three-dimensional form. There is one for cartographic three-dimensional forms that includes globes and relief models. RDA says these are intended to be perceived visually. RDA has a separate content type for cartographic tactile three-dimensional form. No example is given here, but these are defined as intended to be perceived through touch. If you look at some of the other tactile content types, they do give examples. For instance, for tactile text, RDA mentions braille text and other tactile forms of language notation. So that would suggest by analogy that something like a globe or relief model with braille labels would fall into this category. RDA also has an unqualified three-dimensional form content type for content expressed through a form or forms intended to be perceived visually in 3 dimensions. RDA does give some examples here: sculptures, models, naturally occurring objects, and specimens and holograms. Finally, tactile three-dimensional form is content intended to be perceived through touch in 3 dimensions. RDA gives no examples. There are some three-dimensional forms that are tactile in a way that is analogous to tactile text, such as the braille ruler and slate shown here. However, it's not clear to me what line RDA is trying to draw here. If you go back to the previous slide, everything listed here except holograms, which I would argue should actually be a type of three-dimensional still image rather than a three-dimensional form, can usefully be perceived both through vision and through touch. The museum may not let you touch the sculpture, but that doesn't mean that the sculptor wasn't trying to communicate something tactile. Some sculpture is even designed to be touched. So how do you know whether you have a visual three-dimensional form or a tactile three-dimensional form? These categories are not mutually exclusive, and RDA provides no guidance on how to make a decision. Many objects, especially in an educational setting, are not very useful if patrons can't touch and manipulate them. Think about building blocks, jigsaw puzzles, or math manipulatives. So one approach might be to limit tactile three-dimensional forms to things that are intended to be used exclusively through touch, or are capable of being used exclusively through touch. This at least might lead to consistent use of the different terms. Without more guidance than is currently in RDA, different catalogers will make different decisions for the same types of objects, which will make the results unpredictable and thus less useful for patrons. What I have come to think would work better would be for RDA to collapse three-dimensional form and tactile three-dimensional form into a single content type that incorporates both visual and tactile content, and move holograms to a new three-dimensional still image content type. I'm going to talk about carrier description next, starting with the extent element, which RDA defines as a number plus the type of units and/or subunits making up a resource. There's a special instruction for the extent of three-dimensional forms that says to give a number and the appropriate singular or plural term from RDA's list. The results look like we're used to doing now. Here's the list of terms for three-dimensional carriers, three-dimensional forms, carriers in RDA, which looks pretty arbitrary to me. I'm not actually sure why RDA even needs a list here, since the universe of possible three-dimensional forms is infinite. Since the list of terms is arbitrary and short, RDA fortunately goes on to say that if none of the terms listed above is appropriate, Use a term designating the type of unit as concisely as possible. Here are a few examples. Fossil could possibly be subsumed under specimens, but I like to use a more specific term where possible since I think it's more helpful for users. I'm not sure this is technically allowed, but you could argue that the more specific term is more appropriate, or perhaps it's covered by the exception for conventional terminology. RDA also tells you what to do if you have more than one type of unit, as is seen here with this Kwanzaa set. If there are a lot of things, and it's inconvenient or unrealistic to count them, RDA says you can use an approximate number as shown here. Some things are made up of smaller parts or subunits, and RDA allows you to list those in parentheses after the main unit. A couple common examples are multi-part models or games with many pieces. If it's impractical to give even an approximate number, or if you have a lot of different kinds of things and you don't want to list them all in the extent element, RDA says to use the phrase various pieces. This can be used either at the unit or subunit level. RDA tells you to point out when units have identical content, which sometimes happens. RDA also tells you to point out when you have identical sets of units, such as these 5 identical sets of 10 tiles. Base and applied material seem to me to be described in RDA more in terms of still image content than three-dimensional forms. Base material is defined as the underlying physical material of a resource. RDA says to give one or more terms for base material if important for identification or selection, which would be true for most three-dimensional objects. RDA again gives a list of terms to use as shown here. Here are a few examples using terms from RDA's list. RDA again gives you an out if nothing from the list fits. In the extent section, you're only instructed to use a term from outside the list if nothing on the list was appropriate. But here you can choose another term if none of the terms on the list is appropriate or sufficiently specific. Again, RDA tells you to go for concise. Here are a couple examples. Sometimes you have more than one material, either both from RDA's list, both not, or a combination. If you have unlike units, you can presumably combine the base materials for both, as is done in the play money example. There is a note for recording more details about the base materials. If you can't describe the base materials concisely in the main element, I think you could choose to put that information in a note instead. Sometimes objects are mounted and RDA has an element that allows you to describe the mount. There is also a note element for more details about the mount if necessary. This example describes a model that's mounted on a wooden base. There are specific instructions for recording the color of a three-dimensional form. This boils down to, if there are one or two colors, name them. If you have a set of dominoes, say black and white. Where I used to work, they collected a lot of plastic food for teaching about nutrition. For this Pop-Tart replica, you would say beige and pink. If there are more than two colors, like these rainbow-colored musical tubes, record color. Put additional details in a note if they're considered useful. It's also important to record the dimensions of the object or objects so patrons have some idea of how big the thing is that they're going to get. In RDA, dimensions include measurements of height, width, depth, length, gauge, and diameter. RDA tells you to use centimeters, so your metric illiterate patrons still won't know how big the thing is that they have to carry home. However, as in AACR 2, round up your measurements. Remember to treat CM as a symbol rather than an abbreviation. RDA does provide an alternative to use another system of measurement, but the LCPSs authorize inches only for disks and audio carriers. For everything else, for everything except globes in the three-dimensional form section, record the dimensions as height by width by depth if all dimensions are given. The key point, which people often miss, is to start with height, not with the longest dimension. It's useful to think of height as being the vertical dimension when the item is in its natural form. Sometimes it's more practical to give only one dimension. In this case, use a word to indicate which dimension you're giving. Here are a few straightforward examples. Notice that in the last one, the decision was made to give only one dimension. Sometimes you have a bunch of things and they're all the same size and type. In that case, just record the dimensions of one item to stand for them all, as shown here. If you have more than one thing of the same type, which here seems to mean that they're all three-dimensional objects, then RDA tells you to record the size of the smallest or smaller and the size of the largest or larger as a range. There's also an alternative where if there are only two sizes, you record them both. This would seem to lead to the same outcome as the first option. However, in the alternative, if there are more than two things, you record the dimensions of the largest followed by or smaller. This alternative is LC's preference. The problem with both of these options is that they're hard to implement with oddly shaped things. For example, the object with the largest height might have the smallest depth. It's sometimes possible to get around this by reducing the number of dimensions you record. If you have a container, a lot of times it's much easier to record the dimensions of the container. Here are a few examples. The middle one shows how it can sometimes be easier to record only one dimension when a single object isn't the largest or smallest along all dimensions. RDA allows you to record the dimensions of a container rather than that of the object or objects themselves. You can either record the dimensions of both the container and the objects or only the dimensions of the container. Here are a few examples of recording either just the dimensions of the container or the dimensions of both the container and the objects. With irregularly shaped objects, recording a container size often saves a lot of trouble. RDA does not provide instructions for recording a company material as we were used to recording it in MARC 300 subfield E as instructed by AACR 2. During the test, LC advised us to continue current practices until this is resolved. RDA maps 300 subfield E to related manifestation, but the related manifestation instruction doesn't provide much guidance nor any relevant examples. RDA's reverse mapping from related manifestation to MARC goes to a number of fields, but not 300 subfield E. Titles can be challenging for these types of materials. You often have too many or too few titles. There's no standardized location for titles, like the title page of a book. I'm going to give some answers first, and then go through the relevant rules. There are 4 categories of potential sources for titles of objects. For objects, in all cases, RDA instructs you to make a source of title note, although this note is not core. If the title is on the resource itself, don't bracket it. If the title comes from an external source or is devised by the cataloger, do use brackets around the title. The preferred source instruction in RDA Chapter 2 is meant to be used in conjunction with the rule on basis of identification. There's a rule for the basis of identification of resources issued as single units, which is reasonably straightforward for three-dimensional forms. There's another instruction for resources issued in more than one part. Options C and D from this instruction are likely to be relevant here. However, I'm just going to show these options and not try to explain them because the distinction they're trying to make is actually unclear to me. I'm on a CCDA task force that's looking at the rules on preferred sources and bases for identification, and I hope that these particular rules will be easier to understand before most of you have to use them. Here is option C, which is for multi-part resources where the concept of sequential issuing in parts is not applicable. Here's option D for multi-part resources where the concept of ordered parts is not applicable, and there's no source of information identifying the resource as a whole. Since the resources we're talking about are not made of pages or sheets and are not moving images, the relevant rule for preferred sources is 2.2.2.4. The first preferred source is a permanently attached label. Since the objects we're talking about aren't digital, they can't have embedded metadata. So if there's no label, move on to another part of the resource itself, preferring a formal presentation. RDA doesn't always do a very good job of making this clear, but if you're creating a comprehensive description of a resource, a publisher-issued container and accompanying material should be considered part of the resource itself. Here are a couple examples of labels on a resource and the corresponding source of title notes. Since hang tags are often easy to cut off, I'm not sure how permanently attached they should be considered, but since they're supplied by the manufacturer, they should probably count here. It's common for there to be no title on the object itself. In this case, there's often a title on the container or accompanying material that you can use. Here are a couple examples. What happens if there's no title on the resource at all? 2.3.2.10 gives you two options. Take a title from a source external to the resource or make up a title. 2.2.4 gives you a list of external sources in order of preference. It's somewhat confusing that accompanying material appears here, but so far as I can tell, this would only apply if you were doing an analytic description. It would be clearer if that were explicitly stated. Containers not issued as part of the resource, such as a box made by an owner, come here. It's not exactly clear to me how other published descriptions of the resource and any other available source, such as a reference source, differ. Catalog or supplied data seems only to be an option for title proper and is not included in the more general hierarchy, so there seems to be no provision for things like catalog or devised edition statements. If the title or other information is taken from an external source, you should indicate this through a note, bracketing, or some sort of coding. I imagine most of us will continue using bracketing for this purpose as long as we're still using MARC. This is LC's current choice. There's an exception to the requirement to use bracketing or another indication that the title isn't on the resource itself for resources that don't normally carry identifying information. LC is following this exception. In the context of a library collection of educational materials, I have found it useful myself to always indicate that the title is not on the resource itself. The OLAC Music Library Association test group really struggled to understand this instruction, but LC told us that we should indeed read it literally. The rule for notes on title sources says to make a note on the source from which the title proper is taken, if it is a source other than the title page, etc., of a resource consisting of multiple pages, etc., or the title frame or title screen of a moving image. So the literal reading is that you would always make a note for every other type of material that doesn't fall into these two categories. The catch is this element isn't core. This diagram might make this a little clearer. RDA forbids you from making a note for the types of title sources in white. If you're following the instruction, you would make a note for the sources in dark purple. That is, sources other than the title page for things with pages and sources other than title frames for moving images. You would also make a note for any title source for any other type of material, no matter where the title came from. This is represented by the light purple area. The tricky part is that this note isn't core, so you don't have to ever give a note. This means that if there's no note about the source of the title on a record, you don't necessarily know if it means that the title came from one of the parts in white or if the cataloger chose not to give a note. For the sorts of objects we're discussing here that lack a standardized source of title, it's probably beneficial to just always give a source of title note so that others can reproduce what you did. Finally, there's this interesting omission, optional omission. ELCTS is not following this option, and it would seem to apply to things like books with no title page that only have a single title somewhere else, say on the cover. Here are a couple typical examples of bracketed titles from external sources and their associated source of title notes for objects. It is sometimes hard for me to extract the order in which you're supposed to do things from the RDA text. Only here in 2.3.2.11, the rule on devised titles, is it made clear that this rule only kicks in if you can't find a title in any of the sources listed at 2.2.4 on the sources external to the resource. This means that you can only supply a title if you can't find one in an external source, although presumably you only have to make a reasonably exhaustive search. If you do end up devising a title, RDA tells you to make it brief and descriptive and to indicate the nature of the resource, its subject, or both its nature and its subject. Although RDA doesn't explicitly connect these dots, so far as I can tell, since a devised title comes from outside the resource itself, you should bracket it. RDA does tell you to make a note indicating that you've devised a title if the resource is of a type that would normally bear a title. It then refers to 2.20.2.3, which is, as I pointed out previously, not core. Here are some examples. The main difference from AACR2 is that note says title devised by cataloger rather than title supplied by cataloger. If you look objectively at the list of GMDs for three-dimensional forms in AACR2, it's a mixed bag of some odd things that were singled out for special treatment, probably due as much to historical accident as anything. These were presumably the materials most commonly collected by libraries at the time that the GMDs were developed. Anything that doesn't fit into one of the more specific categories gets stuck in the general category of realia, which is frankly not a word used by the general public and unlikely to be intuitive for most users. RDA's object carrier type seems like it will be easier to understand. However, the GMD did sometimes give people a little better idea of what they were going to get than the more general term object does. There's a new element for form of work in RDA. The OLAC group participating in the RDA test thought that this element could be very useful for resources like three-dimensional forms, particularly if the catalog can be made to display this element on the hit list. This element contains a class or genre to which a work belongs and can include some of the things covered in AACR2 by the GMD or a supplied subtitle. The advantage of this element is that it does not come from a controlled list, so you can precisely name whatever comes across your desk in a way that you think will be useful to patrons. There's a similar element in Chapter 7 for nature of content. This is defined as the specific character of the primary content of the resource. It's not obvious to me how this is different from the form of work except that it can't be used in preferred access points for works. It is also unclear to me how much detail you can give in the form of work element. You probably shouldn't give materials such as plastic in the form of work element, since Ferber and RDA consider the work to be more abstract than that, although it's tempting, since physical materials are very much bound up with the essence of objects. Here's an example of a couple ways to bring out the fact that this hat is a toy. You could use toy in the form of work element. Since this is a supplied or devised title, you could also include that information in the title. I am including the rules on these next slides for later reference and not going to spend time on them. I'd only like to point out that you can use form of work and access points, but only when it's needed to distinguish two works. So here's an example where form of work could be helpful in distinguishing two resources with the same title, where one of the cats in the hat is a soft toy and the other one is a hand puppet. Although three-dimensional forms can have publishers and distributors, I want to specifically point out the rules for manufacture and production, as they're more common with these types of materials than with many other types of materials. So 2.10 talks about the manufacture statement, and 2.7 production statements are for unpublished materials. Production statements include statements relating to inscription, fabrication, construction, etc. Note that only the date of production is core. Place and name of producer are optional. There seems to be no equivalent in RDA for the exception in AACR2, where you didn't have to try to come up with a date for naturally occurring objects such as rocks or fossils. So I've only talked about some of the things that are important specifically for three-dimensional forms. You should also use other data elements in more general use as needed. Now I'm going to talk about what AACR2 called kits and how these resources are treated in RDA. AACR2 gave two definitions for kit. I'm going to start with the second one since it's easier to address. These are single medium packages of textual material. The Jackdaw kits mentioned here were popular with libraries at one time, and my former library had a lot of old ones. This was an exception in AACR2 that, as far as I can tell, was not logically justified. It appears to have been a matter of convenience. RDA would just consider what the actual package consists of, so usually they would be treated as text, or perhaps text plus still images, and any shelving decisions would be made independently. Here's the other definition. There was a structural, logical reason why AACR2 was forced to include this category. An item containing two or more categories of material, no one of which is identifiable as the predominant constituent of the item. Materials could have only one GMD in AACR2. If you had a predominant GMD in a company material, this wasn't really a problem. But if you had two or more GMDs of equal importance, you were stuck. So AACR2 provided the GMD kit for this situation. The meaning is more obvious in the term from the British list, multimedia. Basically, it means that the resource contains multiple media, or multiple GMDs. There's no equivalent to this rule in RDA because there's no need for it. RDA supports multiple content, media, and carrier types. If you have this kind of kit, you can do one of two things. You can force a predominant carrier and content type, which is what LC and many other libraries did under AACR2. Or you can provide multiple values, which would seem to be more useful for patrons in most cases. You could make an argument that in AACR or in RDA it might be useful to have some way to indicate a difference between something with multiple carrier content media types that represent a main type plus a company material, or a number of groupings of equal importance, but there is no need for content carrier or media type specifically for kids, since you can include the multiple values. So I'd like to talk briefly about a couple ways to record multiple content, media, and carrier type groupings in MARC. One way would be to make a separate field for each value. You could identify what's being described by each value in subfield 3 as shown here. You could also connect the values that go together with the linking subfield 8. But I don't know of any systems that support subfield 8 either for input or for system manipulation and display. So the advantage of this approach is that it's more human readable, although the fact that most systems reorder these fields numerically undermines that somewhat. So you can see that it would probably work better if all the DVD video ones were together in a block and so forth. The big disadvantage is that it's not really very computer friendly. It's not practical to map on the fly. It's especially over a large result set. It's kind of a brittle, fragile solution. It's easy to break with a typo. And if the computer can't automatically reconstruct the groupings, then it's hard to see how a computer is going to map the groupings to user-friendly icons or terms. For a set of values, it's fairly straightforward if you only have one content, one carrier, and one media type. But here, you could have an infinite number of things in any given subfield 3, and the computer would have to do quite a bit of analysis, or else have done the analysis up front and sort of stored it somewhere. So another option would be to use a single field for each content, media, and carrier type, preferably with the values in a consistent order in each field as shown here. So the ones that go with the moving image content type are in the first subfield A, with the spoken word in the second, and so forth. So the advantage of this is it's potentially more user-friendly, since a computer can more easily take the first value in each field and combine them to map to an icon, then take the second value in each field, and so on. In some situations, this requires what I think of as filler terms to make the values line up. The chief disadvantage is it's not so easy for a human to look at in its raw form. You can see here where it doesn't really line up, that it's a little hard to parse. So this is an example of what I mean. Both of these examples are ways to represent a CD-ROM with still image and textual content, and then it has an accompanying textual guide. Without the duplication of the terms text and computer disk in the first example, which I think of as filler terms to fill out a grid, a computer would come to an incorrect conclusion about the content. This is shown in the second example, where the computer could conclude that there were only images on the CD and completely miss the textual aspect. This particular problem is particularly acute with computer carriers. So here are a few examples of various ways to do the extent statement for kits, depending on the level of detail that you choose to give about the different objects in a kit. And as with three-dimensional objects, include other fields as needed. And this is sort of a gratuitous picture at the end, but one of the more interesting things I cataloged in my former position were these giant microbes, and this is the Ebola virus. I'm not quite sure who would want to put their kid to bed with this, but it was kind of interesting to see the multicolored microbes. And that's the end of what I prepared. It went a little faster than I thought it would, so if anyone has any questions.
Hi everyone, it's Diane again. I have some of your questions that you have been submitting during the webinar. If you have not yet typed your question into the question box, please go ahead and do it. and I will start reading these off to Kelley, and we'll see if we can fit them all in the time we have. Here's one for you, Kelley. Please address the description of, for example, a Lego set intended to construct a particular object, such as a building or an animal.
Well, so I would imagine that the Lego set, if it came intended to construct a certain object, that it would have that sort of as the title on the container, hopefully. So you could make that clear to people with the title. And you could, as I kind of talked about, that form of work being helpful. If it wasn't clear from the title that it was a Lego set, you could use the form of work to bring out the fact that this is some kind of Lego set or something. And in the extent section, depending, you could just go with various pieces and give the container size. If you wanted to, I suppose you could count the pieces. It kind of depends on how much detail either your users or your circulation staff require and how much time you have to spend on it. But that would be the general things I could think of.
Someone asks about brackets. The comment is, I thought brackets went away in RDA.
Well, for some things, brackets have gone away, but they haven't completely. And let me see here, because I completely just quoted this rule, but I have to figure out where I put it. But it does actually mention brackets in RDA. I didn't make that up. Okay, here we go. So, all right. Okay, so what the rule here says, this is actually indicating a title not on the resource itself. So RDA uses brackets. You're not required in RDA to use brackets to indicate that the title is not on the resource itself. The rule given here actually gives you a couple of options, one of which is you could just make a note, so in some ways it actually does seem as if the note, title from publisher's website could substitute for the brackets. So if you took that approach, I think you're not forced to use brackets. And then the alternative that's given here is some other means, for example, through coding, which we don't really have that option in MARC, or through the use of square brackets, which is, of course, what we're used to from AACR2. And so LC's decision, if you're following the LC policy statements, at least the last time I looked, was to continue the use of square brackets to indicate this. There's another section where it talks about, each of the different areas of the description, the elements that describe the manifestation have a preferred source, which is generally supposed to be the same as the source of the title proper. And there are some instructions for when you take how you identify information that's not on there. But I'm probably not going to find it right now. So I'm not sure that RDA itself obligates you to use square brackets, but they haven't completely gone away now.
Another clarification question about CM with or without a period. Can you just repeat what the status is of CM as a symbol and the presence or absence of a period?
Well, I have not reviewed this recently, so I'm not, and I think some of it then depends on what's after it and whether you're using ISBD punctuation, where sometimes you're required to use a period after the extent statement because of that. But in general, centimeter is, the CM abbreviation is, since it's considered a symbol, you wouldn't necessarily need a period after it unless there was something else about the structure of the data element that would require a period.
Right, that was my understanding as well. We've had a couple of questions about book discussion kits, which include 15 books and an audio book and a discussion guide. How would we treat those? Kit is in quotation marks.
Right, right. And so, of course, it's kind of, I think it would be similar to any of these, where you would use one of these options to bring out all of the content carrier and media types that apply. So you would have one for the books, one, for the audio material, one for, if they included some other kind of, I don't know, party favors, you would have one for that. So it would fall under this, and then in the extent section, you would have a few options. Various pieces is probably not very helpful to your patrons, but you could describe, for example, each of the particular things that you have in there. Now, I'm not entirely sure how to reconcile, the fact that, for example, you have 15 identical books because of the way that the extent is given for books in terms of pages, whereas what you would probably really like is something more like what I kind of made up here in this middle example, except that you would probably want to say 15, and then remember how RDA told you to say identical if something is the same. So 15 identical books, and then you would probably want to have a contents note or a summary note or something that would tell people exactly what, books and give more details about the things that are in the kit. But that's how I would approach that, other than sort of the problem of if you did it in this style, it's a little hard to sort of express the concept of 15 identical books.
We've had somebody write in with a comment about the square brackets question. I'm just going to read this. RDA 1.7.5 transcription is one place where square brackets are prescribed in RDA. So it's not necessarily the example you gave, but they haven't disappeared entirely.
Okay. Well, that's... Yeah, I should say that I really have not been working in RDA myself since the test, so I'm a little bit out of practice, so hopefully nobody's going to ask me anything too obscure. I think we're all still dealing with the learning curve here with RDA, or most of us. So 1.7.5, replace symbols and other characters that cannot be produced by the facilities available with a description of the symbol enclosed in square brackets.
Okay. Is there, oops, excuse me one second, there was a question about the filing implications of whether centimeter ends with a period or not. I'm not sure where that's filing, but I'm passing on the question.
Okay, yeah, I'm not really sure I understand what that question is either. Perhaps if the person could clarify.
Okay. I get science kits with many items for experiments or projects. Example, a fish kit with fish food, tanks, sand, and rocks. How would you do a kit like this?
Well, depending what's in it, it may in fact be a collection of, in RDA's terms, a collection of objects, perhaps with some sort of guide telling the teacher or the students how to use it. I mean, at least the things that were named there. In any event, I think the basic thing that you want to do is figure out what you have, and rather than having to come up like with one global term for the whole thing, come up with, what is the content carrier and media type for each individual thing that makes up the collection of objects that you're cataloging. And probably in most cases, at least for the significant aspects of the collection of whatever you have, you would want to give each of them their own content carrier and media type. And then again, as it showed in the section on extent for three-dimensional objects, you can really just, give detail either sort of like so I should have fewer slides. So I think, let's see. So this was my example here where you can just sort of list the things that you have. And like I said, usually if you have a lot of things, if they've come in a container, it's a lot easier to just give the dimensions of the container. And you might have to treat it more like the examples I gave for the kit extent if, for example, in addition to the different types of objects, it came, say, with a CD-ROM with a game on it, and also, like workbooks. It could come with, 5 identical workbooks for the students. There's kind of a lot of variations you could think of. But I think the main thing is to sort of think through what different kinds of things you have in this collection of objects and try to bring them all out, and then possibly to use that, form of work element as well as the summary or contents note to bring out specific details and to kind of explain in more detail what people are likely to get.
So we have lots of kit questions coming in now. When I do a story time kit, which often includes books, music, puppets, finger plays, DVDs, would option 1 be the best bet for describing everything? I also use the title on the box that the children's librarian came up with. Is that kosher?
So option 1. No, I'm not sure which option 1 they're talking about. Do you know? Is that but as far as the title that the children's librarian, well, I guess it kind of depends. If it's a kit that's like a commercially published kit, then if you're putting it into a shared catalog or something, you'd want to use that title. But if it's a kit that, you just sort of say put together locally, then, it certainly would be appropriate to use the title that the children's librarian came up with. Or for your local catalog, you could always use the title that you came up with that you thought was going to be more helpful and just put title. I would probably just put title devised by cataloger and not like go into detail title devised by children's librarian. But you certainly could do that in your local catalog, or like I said, that would be probably your only option if it was kind of a made-up kit.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like, a locally created kit.
Yeah.
Since accompanying material treatment has not been settled, will there be more instances of kits, such as a CD plus a libretto?
Well, I don't know. I think actually that there is some work going on to settle the accompanying material question. And I think in practice that people are probably just kind of continuing with what they've done in ACR2. it really doesn't sort of change whether the two things are equal or whether one thing is main and one is accompanying material. It just sort of, the way RDA is currently written, it doesn't provide guidance for the sort of options that you would sometimes want to have with accompanying material, where you want to mention it but you don't want to, go into a lot of detail. So I think that, if it's working for you, I would stick with LC's advice to kind of just keep doing what you've been doing for that type of material in 300 subfield E. And there is some work in progress to kind of try to address this gap.
Back to that locally created kit, what is there a publisher or manufacturer? If the library has assembled the kit themselves, what is their role in the creation of this kit?
Well, that is an interesting question, because of course you've got, and I would say, of course that's, a lot of times when you talk about, you might consider that an unpublished item, the collection of things. I have to say that's not actually a problem that I've encountered myself. So let me see here what it says about production. So unpublished form, except that in fact, these kinds of kits are, it's sort of made up of a number of published things, but they've probably not been published or manufactured by the same entity, so you wouldn't have a statement like that. But if you considered it unpublished, I guess you could just give a date, since you only have to give a date if it's considered unpublished. Let me kind of look into that. I have not, a sort of a assembled collection of published items, I'm not sure.
Okay, we're almost out of time. There are a couple of quick ones. One is a comment that it's hoped that the successor to MARC will include drop-down menus for the 3XS fields rather than having to consult lists and grids. So that's a comment from someone, and then there's a question about exactly those fields. In 336 to 338, if accompanying material is the same as primary material, does the delimiter have to be repeated?
I think if they're the exact same material, there would probably not be any need to repeat it. It probably wouldn't serve any functional purpose. So I think you would need, probably for the purpose that I would see these being used for, you would want to record each unique combination of content carrier media types once. And in this sort of grid-like example, I did repeat things, but only because the particular combinations were unique. Or if you were doing this other type of thing with the subfield 3, then you might choose to, repeat it if you felt it was important to bring out the accompanying material at this level. But I think as far as like the kind of limiting that a computer would do, there would be no advantage if it was exactly the same to duplicating it.
Okay, we're just about out of time, although someone did ask if people have follow-up questions, would you be willing to take them offline and answer them?
I can certainly try. Like I said at the very beginning, the big caveat is this is my best understanding at this point in time, and not all of this is as well worked out as it could be, but I'm certainly happy to do my best to try to interpret what's going on.
All right. I'll take the presentation rights back to just wrap up. One second while I get my PowerPoint back. I apologize, it seems to have closed itself. Okay, here we go. So first of all, a thank you to Kelley for really tackling a very complex yet fun topic using RDA for objects and kits. Just to show you the remaining webinars in our RDA series this spring on rare materials and archival materials. And of course, there is special pricing when you register for multiple topics. And we are thinking now about additional RDA webinars for the fall, so we'd be happy to hear from you if you have suggestions. And be sure to check out the ALCTS website for registration information and upcoming webinars and any other ALCTS continuing education events. Attendees will receive an online evaluation form from ALCTS. Please respond as we value your input. We welcome your suggestions for new webinars, and you'll find a form on the website for submitting webinar proposals. Before we sign off, I would like to thank Eva Sorel for providing technical support for today's webinar. We appreciate your attendance today, and we look forward to sharing other topics with you in the future. Have a good day.